Dan Mitchell says the stimulus has been a flop. And Dan, my biggest problem with this is when you take so much money out of the private sector, which inevitably you do when you have to borrow almost $1 trillion to put in the stimulus plan, you're putting money in the hands of people who use it a lot less efficiently than the private sector.
You're exactly right. The whole notion of Keynesian economics, which was behind this so-called stimulus plan, is that we're going to borrow money out of the economy's left pocket and then put it in the economy's right pocket. But not only that, which we know is a sort of just a confidence game, we're transferring resources from the productive sector of the economy to a bunch of corrupt politicians. And we know from history that Keynesianism didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt. It didn't work for Japan in the 1990s. It didn't work for Bush in 2008. So, of course, it didn't work for Obama in 2009.
Dan, I don't know how you can say it didn't work for Roosevelt. We pulled out of the Great Depression. Granted, it took many years, and we saw a severe dip shortly after 1929 in the early 30s. But looking at what John Lonsky's argument is, that things would be that much worse if it weren't for the stimulus. You don't see that at all?
Well, first, the Great Depression was an ultimate failure of big government. We stayed in a downturn for 12 years. Why? Because Hoover and Roosevelt kept increasing spending, increasing tax rates,
no,
increasing
there was
government
protectionism at the time. Smoot-Hawley, people would argue, really tripped off.
Protectionism, too. There was a whole series of government mistakes that kept the economy in the toilet for a long period of time. Now, in terms of what's happening now with the economy, making government bigger is not good for economic growth. It's instead going to turn us into a European-style welfare state with permanently high unemployment rates. And again, I'm not making this as a partisan point. The exact same criticism is something we made against Bush in 2008 when he tried his so-called Keynesian program. But don't believe me. Let's look at what the White House said last year. Last year, the administration said that if we don't do a so-called stimulus, the unemployment rate will rise to 9%. If we do it, it'll stay at 8%, and instead it jumped to 10%. Why? Because giving politicians more control over our economy is never a recipe for anything other than fattening the wallets of lobbyists.
Dan, what about the funny numbers that we hear? Today we heard the president use a number that the CBO doesn't use anymore. We remember, of course, those phantom districts that in which supposedly jobs were created that didn't even exist. The public doesn't believe the administration's figures on jobs anymore, do they?
Well, they shouldn't, because the administration wound up coming up with this crazy number of jobs saved or created. Now, we can all look at the Department of Labor website, and we can see that we've lost more than 3 million jobs since the so-called stimulus was adopted. But the administration comes up with this imaginary benchmark and says we've created 2 million jobs. They might as well say they've also cured cancer and given peace to the Middle East,
right,
as long as they're busy making things up.
We just got to emphasize the monthly job report. Obviously, everybody believes these are figures that are calculated and checked. Sometimes they are revised. Usually they're revised. But what we're talking about are these claims to have created or saved all these millions of jobs, which, frankly, a lot of people don't believe.
And they're right to not believe it. You talked about that polling data earlier. I'm surprised there are 6% of the American people who do think that this big spending bill has created more jobs. The only jobs that have been created have been for lobbyists, and those have been offset by the destruction of jobs in the productive sector of the economy. We're going to wind up being like Greece if we continue down this path of the Bush-Obama big government policy.
Good to see you, Dan. Dan Mitchell, thanks for coming in. Appreciate what the administration